revolution. This is the march of the Black Bloc. Now, recently, after the revolution of Egypt, we have had the rise of new anarchist groups. The leading anarchist group is the Black Bloc, and we are fundamentally in support of it. Before I describe exactly what that means, I want to explain a little bit about who the Black Bloc is for those of you who may not be in the know. So there's three features that are important in regards to who the Black Bloc are as anarchist groups within Egypt. The first one is that they act with anonymity. It's always a hard word. They act with anonymity. They always wear black when they do things. They were more than capable and willing to resort to violence, oftentimes. But more specifically, they respond to violence directly in response to Mohammed Morsi's policies. So we see that time and time again, whenever Morsi does things that they feel are tyrannical, they will respond with vengeance. Whenever there's violence to direct individuals, they are always directly related to government officials. And we're in support of them. We think it's great. Specifically, we think it's good for democracy within Egypt. Yes, terribly burden for us, but we think we can have a good debate. And more importantly, we think we can set up parameters so that we can have a really interesting and meaningful discussion about what terrorism is. And we don't think this is terrorism. We think this is an essential part of the democratic process. We think on the whole, if you believe that their activities are going to be doing more good for Egypt in the long run, we think we should win this debate. We think if you recognize that the Black Bloc is a necessary tool to developing democracy, and that ultimately Egypt is better off because of their actions against the government, we think we deserve to win. Sure.
We think it matters less what you see them as, and how you define them as terrorists or not terrorists, and how Mohammed Morsi sees them and how he's going to respond to them, because we think it's going to be very negative.
Yes, we agree. We think it's always in the interest of the ruling government to see any opposition and label them terrorists. We see that around the globe. We say that you, Mr. Speaker, people of the room, we think you, as individuals, should not consider them as terrorists. We think you should make a meaningful distinction between the actions we see within the Black Bloc and members of Al-Qaeda, let's say. We think if we can prove that, we think that's fine. We think that's as much modeling as we want. We think we want a really broad and general discussion here about the actions of the Black Bloc and whether or not we should see them as pernicious to Egypt as a whole. Before I do that, let me draw up my case line. I haven't made any arguments yet. Glad you're very eager to learn. So, first of all, we think democracy isn't about a majority. We think it's about representation. We think that's lacking within the new democracy of Egypt, and because of that, we create a system that is an extension of tyranny. So we want to have a normative discussion here about what's best for democracy in Egypt and what's best for the individuals of Egypt long run. Second of all, I want to talk about, because we do believe that there's tyranny on the cause of government of Morsi that is thus justified to act with violence. That's obviously going to be my substantial argumentation. So first of all, so we think that oftentimes, whenever all you need to do is get the majority of a house to be ruling of a country, this is likewise abused. We think we see this throughout the developing world and emerging democracies all the time, where you necessarily have a majority government become tyrannical and non-representative of the minority parties of the House. We think what you see in developed countries that have done democracy far long is they understand the system much better. They don't try to game it. They are in for the long haul. They don't just want the short-term interests of the political party while they're reigning for 3 or 4 years. They genuinely want to have a good reputation within that country so that they can reign consistently on and off, mostly on, for the duration of that country's state. We don't see that. We see short-term interests dominating the discussions of politics within new democracies. We think what really sets the United States apart isn't the fact that it's the most democratic, it's actually that it's the least democratic. The amount of checks and balances that are within the United States, the judicial system, the House of Parliament, these are the things that keep the president in check. We think those are the things that lie to create good discussion and ultimately produce liberties for the state. When we don't see liberties within the democracy, we don't think that that democracy is doing anything at all. We think it's a bad representation, and sometimes it's justified to respond to that bad tyranny with violence. Before I get to that.
Democracy is not about documents, it's about belief. And the belief you engender in a populace when you say proactive use of violence is acceptable destroys the very foundation of a civic society.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to disagree with you in my substantial argumentation. No violence just right now, but thanks. I'm glad I know your case line. That's wonderful. Okay, so this is the analysis of 100%. What is violence, Mr. Speaker? Well, we think it's one thing to actively respond to an individual and hit them, but we don't think that's what makes violence pernicious, right? We think what ultimately is the root of violence. What is the root of evil within violence? Is the nature that you're not worthy of discourse. You're not an individual that I can recognize as my individual. I can recognize as my equal. You're below that level of intelligence. You're below that level of engagement. It's a form of engagement that dictates that you are basically an animal. That I'm not an individual that I need to talk to. I can treat you however I want. But then tyranny is also an expression of violence. And we say that violence is justified so long as it gets a general message across that is out to stop that tyranny. That is out to stop that violence. We see that more so represented within the Black Bloc than the ruling government right now. Are we just talking about it? No, we think the tyranny actually exists within Egypt. We think Morsi's government has been abusive, largely because they don't know what democracy is quite yet, but it's a system that's been excruciatingly gained by Morsi himself. They cripple protesters. They install regressive policies like never before. We see the return of the burqa within Egypt today, and that makes us devastatingly sad, because that's not representative of the minority in Egypt. It is only representative of a very, 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 very small majority. And even within that majority, that doesn't necessarily represent their interests. We think a lot of individuals were unjustly forced to vote for the Muslim Brotherhood because the alternative was so closely tied to Mubarak. We don't think that's fair. We don't think we represent anyone in that state. So that's problematic. We think suppression of individuals is bad. We think the return of the burqa is bad. In majority, you see consistently Morsi's policies are regressive and necessarily are ones that are tyrannical. He wishes to gather support more and more. We see that within his installation of new constitutional reform that would give him more power. Thankfully, it was shut down, but we think this is characteristic of the individual and his incentives. So, we think when an individual is pushed against a corner and no one's willing to engage with them, we think it's justified to cry out because you don't have any other means. We think when an individual doesn't recognize you on the parliamentary floor, we think when an individual games the system so they have a monopoly over media, and you have no other means to communicate your message, no other way to communicate your grievances, sometimes you have to commit to acts of anarchy. Sometimes you necessarily need to stop trains from running so that you get some coverage, so that someone in the world will say, who is the Black Bloc? Because I think if it's representative of the amount of suppression they have, then very few of us know who the Black Bloc is. I don't think that's incidental. I think that's the work of Morsi. I think if you actually recognize the kinds of activities the Black Bloc were doing, it's strange that very many of us don't actually know who that is. That's the work of Morsi. That's the response of individual news networks who refuse to recognize them as anything else than terrorists. But I think my partner Morgan, who is quite proficient with terrorism, is going to point out specifically on an ethical level, on a political level, why it is that there's vast amounts of distinction between them and terrorists. So because I think at the end of the debate, you're going to ultimately come to the decision that this is a moral discussion about what is best for democracy in the long run. You're going to have to decide, are these individuals that actually did more good than bad by disturbing the status quo of tyrannical government? Because ultimately we believe that you're going to come to a conclusion that, like, at the end of the day, it was better that they existed. We're very, very proud. Super proud.
Thank you very much.
Everyone ready? I must regret to inform you that supporting this motion as written is a logical impossibility. And the reason it is an impossibility is because the Black Bloc is not an anarchist movement. If you read the fundamental philosophy of anarchism, of philosophers like Murray Rothbard, the core of anarchism is the principle of non-aggression, that violence is only ever justified in self-defense, that an act of aggression against another is never permissible, that a violation of rights and a systemic suppression of rights is always unacceptable to engage in, regardless of the ends you may seek to justify. And it is because the Black Bloc movement was born in violence that they explicitly advocate divisiveness in society, and because they send the message that you can achieve your ends not through democracy, not through progress, but through the use of violence, attacks, and suppression, that we must reject this motion. Now, before I get into the specifics of my case and discuss the way that legitimizing violence in an emerging democratic society necessarily destroys and distorts the social contract, I want to engage with the points brought by the last speaker, because I think there's a dangerous misconception that's been advanced here. And the misconception there is that this is a debate about terrorism, that this is a debate about anarchism, that if they merely prove that the Black Bloc movement is not a group of terrorists, they have won the debate. But we will concede that on the front. We will concede that the Black Bloc movement is not a group of terrorists. But we will not concede that it's not harmful to democracy. And that is what we will prove. And why is the Black Bloc movement harmful to democracy? Because at their foundation, on their first day of movement in the streets, they began by attacking 8 outposts of the Muslim Brotherhood. Political outposts, not outposts of the government, not outposts of the military, not outposts of the police, but legitimate forms of political expression. And it seems odd to me that if you would support a movement that promotes democracy, you would support a movement that begins its existence with acts of violence against other people's political, legitimate agendas. And this is another thing we need to realize, because they portray the Black Bloc as nobles, that they are people seeking only to promote expression in Egypt, and that position, that characterization is a lie. The Black Bloc movement has very specific policies. that they are allowed to preemptively use violence against the government, that Islamic forces should be kept out of government, that they are explicitly opposed to a non-secular society, that they are in fact feel no obligation to conform with the legitimate democratic demands of Egyptian society. So is there corruption in Egypt? Yes, there is corruption in Egypt, but that isn't what the Black Bloc movement stands for. The Black Bloc is about advocation of their pseudo-anarchist ends through violence, through any means necessary, with no justification and no respect for the social contract, and for the proposition to characterize that as a pro-democratic movement is a lie. Closing comment.
So are you saying that political movements can never justify using violence? Like, I feel like there's got to be some times when violence is okay.
We agree. There are cases under which a political movement can use violence. That is the case. A political violence cannot preemptively use violence as a tool of suppression against another political group, which they did against outposts of the Muslim Brotherhood. That is the key distinction here. They aren't attacking the government, they're attacking their enemies. So what is it that we see as important? Now, they talk to us about civil liberties, about protecting democracy. And what we can see is that those things don't exist in other countries because of documents. They don't exist because of institutions. They exist because we believe they are important. Constitutions protect civil liberties at the point that the populace believes in that constitution as a method of protection. They talk about the erosion of civil liberties in the United States. That was because after the September 11th attacks, we as a society were suckered into believing that we needed to give up our civil liberties. The documents didn't change, our mindset changed. And if you are going to foster democracy in an emerging society like Egypt, it is the mindset of democracy that must be protected. So what does it do when we support the Black Bloc movement? What happens is we tell people, you don't need to go through the democratic process. We agree that progress is slow in Egypt, that there are growing pains towards a democratic society. But we have seen success. We've seen protesters manage to change government policy. We've seen the military support the populace. We've seen the Supreme Court take an activist stance against a corrupt parliament. There is progress in Egypt. And the message that needs to be sent to the Egyptian populace is that if you trust in the institutions of democracy, if you are a legitimate participant in civil society, you can get change. You can make progress occur. Yes?
Okay, so I don't care if you think the Sons of Liberties were good or bad terrorists. I care about them because they were good society, because it got to us here today.
I have no idea what you're talking about. That was a revolution against a sovereign state that was opposing oppression on the United States. The idea that this is somehow parallel to a system where there's a legitimate avenue for reform in Egypt that has worked in the past is simply fallacious. So what does the Black Bloc movement do when it's supported in Egypt? The message it sends to the populace is you do not need to participate in the democratic process. You can opt out. You can use violence. You can preemptively attack other political groups. And what happens then? Then you destroy the faith of the public in the democratic process. You tell them, yeah, I can play the game when it benefits me, but when it doesn't benefit me, I can ignore it. This is the very abuse that they told us about Morsi that we need to combat. We need to tell the Egyptian populace, when you trust in democracy, you can get progress, and supporting a group that explicitly advocates violence accomplishes the opposite objective. So there's two futures for Egypt. There's the future of progress, of slow growth, where there are growing pains in democracy, but you build a civil society where people believe in the fundamental efficacy of a democratic system. And then there's where Egypt becomes Russia. We move into a post-Soviet Egypt, where people have no faith in the institution, where corruption runs rampant, where political offices are co-opted because people don't believe in the fundamental efficacy of the system. What we recognize on the opposition is democracies are not about words on a page. They aren't about people in office. They're about the belief of the public in the very idea of democracy. When you legitimize a group that advocates preemptive violence against other forms of political expression, you necessarily undermine that. It is because we stand on the opposition for a truly democratic Egypt, now and in the future, free of this sort of violence. We strongly urge you to oppose this motion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Don't want this table. It's short and I'm tall. to convince you that violence can promote democracy and is promoting democracy as we see it happening in Egypt right now. And after this speech, I think you'll see that actually the government team is clearly winning the debate thus far. Okay, so let's talk about violence and democracy. So violence becomes a legitimate message, a legitimate means of communicating a message, and a legitimate means of achieving more democracy, a legitimate means of achieving representation, which is what my partner was talking to you about. So it becomes a legitimate means to gain this kind of democracy when your peaceful avenues of achieving this message and your peaceful avenues of attaining democracy are stifled or oppressed. So when the opposition tells you there's no connection between Sons of Liberty and Black Bloc, they clearly don't understand what oppression is, and they clearly don't understand what is happening in Egypt right now. So what we see is an increasingly repressive regime in Egypt that may have been democratically elected, but they're increasingly taking away people's ability to peacefully protest and have kind of like this more peaceful means of communicating democratic ends. This is what we see increasingly happening when we have more support for the police, the army on the street, curfews imposed, and things like that. We see that peaceful protest isn't being supported or encouraged by the government. We see that they're actually trying to suppress these kinds of advocacy, these kinds of discourse. We think that is really problematic. So we have this group coming out of this big mess. We have the Black Bloc coming out to try to promote democracy through violent means as the only means left for them to achieve. And we see this not by preemptively striking government offices, but by responsively targeting government offices, by responsibly targeting government officials as part of a participant in this oppressive regime. This is what we see coming out. So we think that it is legitimate to target a repressive regime when that regime is not allowing you to be fully self-expressive. And we think that that is really where we find democracy. It's not by this so-called label, putting a label on democracy, oh, you were elected, therefore you are automatically democratic. We don't think that is really true to characterize the regime as in Egypt. We don't think that it is acceptable for a government to be impervious to criticism because they subdue the media or control the media, because they impose curfews, because they impose armies on the streets. We don't really think that that's actually democracy. We think that we allow, we allow groups, we think it's legitimate for groups to communicate their message going against this democracy, which is not really democracy because it's not representative. We think that that is acceptable. Yes, your point.
And what is the end game in a society that believes that you can use violence to achieve democratic means? What if they win and then the Islamic groups are foremost the Black Bloc with the same means? This can only perpetuate a cycle of violence.
Okay. We are okay with the burden that violence is sometimes justified. We accept that burden. We've been quite explicit in doing so. We think that violence is not justified if you have legitimate peaceful means or viable peaceful means to communicate your message. But when violence becomes acceptable is when those peaceful means are oppressed. When you are not allowed to go about those peaceful means of communicating your message. That is when violence is justified. I don't know how I can make that any more clear in our side of the House. You're going to have to prove to me why violence is never justified in the condition when your peaceful avenues are being suppressed. You're going to have to prove that, and you haven't done that so far. So good luck to you. Okay, now I'm going to talk about liberties, and I think I've already touched upon this as well. We think that liberties are absolutely essential to uphold when you have a government that is trying to represent your people. So essentially, representation comes about when you allow people to act in as free of ways possible in living out their lives. And this is what we see, this is why we support liberty so much. Because only through maximizing individual liberty is when you allow people to fulfill their lives, you allow people to find the path through life that makes them the most comfortable with finding how they view themselves in society. So we don't think that a government is representative of its people when it doesn't allow these liberties to happen. When it doesn't allow individuals to find their own path through life. When you don't allow individuals to express express themselves as they see fit, to put value upon their own culture and what they see as their important culture. So, yes, perhaps Morsi was elected as like an Islamic representative, but we don't think that that actually represents Egyptian society as a whole. We think that saying that Egyptian society supports like regressive Islamic policies doesn't actually represent the Islamic population. We think that that is problematic because what you're actually doing is reducing people's liberty and reducing people's freedom to express their culture how they see fit, and other forms of expression as well, which I've already talked about. So we think that when you reinstate things like the burqa and like try to impose that through the population, we think that is entirely regressive and takes away liberty. We think that's really problematic. Your point, sir.
Does the Black Bloc represent the majority of Egyptians' views? Because you seem very willing to give them a lot of power, especially political power, in Egypt.
Okay, so the Black Bloc itself may not be like representative of every single individual in Egyptian society. That's okay. What we see them as is a representative of a group that is willing to protest against a repressive regime. We choose the Black Bloc's protest and bringing back democracy to Egypt where it is sorely lacking, rather than allowing a regime to carry on unchallenged. Yes, we think that the Black Bloc is more legitimate in these methods than allowing a government to simply say and do whatever it wants. That is not acceptable. So while the Black Bloc is not like the only voice out there, currently it is the only one really taking a stance to challenge the government, and we support the rise of the Black Bloc, much like we would support the rise of other groups doing the same type of actions. We support that. So finally, democracy in and of itself is not a good, as the opposition seems to think. Democracy is attained, as I've already talked about, when you achieve representation. Electing somebody in government isn't the same. Like getting that majority vote isn't the same as truly being representative. Because you have governments that choose to oppress other people's voices, to impose their own agenda, their own Muslim Brotherhood agenda on the population that doesn't want that as a whole. We support the Black Bloc because we support bringing democracy and representation to Egypt. Thank you.
Very much. Maybe you're up.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, what is the end game? This was a question posed by my partner that never received an answer from opening proposition. Because in all of their language of optimistic political change, of representation, and of democracy, they failed to look at what is the impact of supporting violence in a burgeoning democracy. Not only for the theoretical reasons that my partner gave you, about how this inherently undermines standing systems of democracy, but for other reasons that has future implications that I will introduce for the stability of the Egyptian state because of the way in which violence begets violence in this particular situation. But first, let me answer the claims provided by the last speaker. So the first thing we continually harp on is how violence in democracies is justified, how it's a means to gain representation. But what they fail to do is look at the long-term harms that come when you justify violence in the short term. First of all, you have the analysis that my partner already gave you. People lose their faith in the democratic system. It's not that because the United States has a constitution, we have civil liberties. It's because we as a populace buy into that constitution that we have civil liberties. When you go against that buy-in, when you tell people that there's not a reason for them to be a part of the system, you act out against it, you're not forming legitimate political discourse, but instead you're further ostracizing people from what this ideal democracy ought to be. But then secondly, and as I will show you in my positive matter, you're not actually helping Egypt get a democracy by supporting violence, especially when it's going to spur retaliation violence, not only internally, but also externally from local actors in the region. Then you also get this notion about how they responsibly attack the government as a means of sending messages against the government. Once again, they ignore the analysis my partner gave you. They're not merely attacking the government, they're attacking political parties. They're attacking representations of those political parties, like the Muslim Brotherhood post. We don't see that as a legitimate form of striking against your oppression by attacking a post of a political party that's not actually sending an effective message to the government that's going to spur some change. And then she gives you this last analysis at the very end of her speech about the benefits of representation and the benefits of democracy. I'm just going to respond to that by saying we agree with the benefits of representation. This just is the most effective means to obtain those means of representation, not only in the short term, but also in the long term. Because this is the final piece of analysis they ignore from my partner. He doesn't deny that democracy in Egypt will take time. He denies that this violence is the way to bring it about. We think that progress is slow, but we do think that it's going to be effective. We see things such as the Supreme Court saying that they do not support the abuse of parliament. We see peaceful protests still taking place. We see individuals like Nawa El-Sadawi fighting for women's rights in this region by opposing things such as the burqa, by non-violent means, by using writing, by using language, by spurring women populations to protest against these things. We see this change happening on the ground, and we do think it's going to take some time. But we prefer this time for two key reasons. One, still the analysis my partner gave you. When you take this time, when the individuals are seeing their democracy grow, when they see how they as individuals can pursue democratic pathways to ensure their democratic civil liberties are protected, they're going to have more buy-in for that system in the long haul. That's the end game that we on site opposition have. We want individuals to have this buy-in to the system, because that's how you're going to have effective systems of representation in the long term. Instead of this constant flux of individuals fighting for this power in this government, and then other non-representative of majority groups responding to the majority power, be it through violence. We don't think that that system, that cyclical pattern of falling and rising, is what's actually effectively representing or pursuing the best rights of the Egyptian citizenry. We think that this language that they give you about representation is almost entirely false about actually achieving the equality and representation they so desire. And before I go on to my new point of positive matter, go ahead.
So how can you get people to have buy-in with these political rights before they exist? It's clear that in Egypt those rights are lacking.
Because individuals are discussing these rights. It's not like they don't know what they want or what rights they would ideally have in the future. It's that they're making the pathways by which to obtain these rights through the government. That's why they had the first revolt in the first place. They identified that there were rights that they didn't have, that they wanted to have as individuals. That's why they adopted peaceful protests to begin to obtain them. We think they're going to continue that pathway. Once again, we're not saying we solve for all these problems in the short term. We're saying that we're okay with a long-term solution because we think that's better going to entrench democratic values not only in the Egyptian state, but most importantly, in the hearts of the Egyptian people. Because it's in their buy-in to that system that it actually obtains any efficacy. But then, even if you don't believe any of that, even if you don't think anything I said was relevant, and you don't believe the analysis of my partner, you're still not going to vote for side proposition. And here's why. Because all of this language of representation through violence doesn't actually look at what the impact of this violence is, particularly when you look at the actor. We're not upset by the Black Bloc because they're an anarchist group or supposedly a terrorist group. We're upset with them partly because their values of anti-Islamism are not going to be an effective representation in that state. So one, what happens internally when this anti-Islamic group begins to act up trying to seek power through violent means? You get violent responses from Islamic groups in the area. So one, we don't think that's going to help obtain stability in any way. Secondly, any government that forms out of that violence and that conflict is inevitably only going to be favorable to one side of that conflict. They're not going to be responsive to listening to all Egyptian individuals. They're only going to listen to their particular constituency. The problems they identify with the current system, they're only perpetuating with the violence that they argue for. So we think that's really important on the first step. But we also think there's a regional parameter to this problem that must be examined. We think, and we know, that there are lots of Islamic countries in that region, a lot of Islamic groups in that region, that are going to respond when the Black Bloc gets more power. They're going to continually be going against that Black Bloc and ensuring, A, that they don't get power, and if they do, they're not going to be interacting with Egypt as a region that supports the Black Bloc. They're not going to try to engage with them with regional politics, regional diplomacy, or regional discussion. The Black Bloc isn't going to obtain that in the long term. You're actually going to sacrifice their position in the region as a whole. Because individuals are not going to want to engage, because other groups are going to respond to the presence of an anti-Islamic group taking any sort of power or attraction within Egypt. So what do you have at the end of this debate? We think firstly, on the point of buying to the democratic system, side opposition wins alone. We're talking about long-term change of people identifying the civil liberties that they need and then creating a system that they as individuals believe will have an effective means for their populace and for themselves. But then secondarily, if that's insufficient for you, you still have the side opposition argument that there's going to be a response internally of violence. that you're going to have conflict internally between Islamic groups and between the Black Bloc, and then any sort of government that forms after that isn't going to be this all-powerful utopian democracy that preserves the right of everyone, but instead it's inevitably still going to be favoring one group, not creating means or policies that protect everyone, and still biased and still responsible for the harms that they supposedly identify. And it's for all these reasons that we are proud to oppose.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the problems that we found so far in this round, particularly with the arguments coming out of the opposition, is that they're not really recognizing the reality and the context in which this Black Bloc is growing within Egypt. At the point where they're not looking at the deep political divide within Egypt as they are now, they're fundamentally misunderstanding the goals and the means through which the Black Bloc are trying to achieve those goals as being effective. So, when we address this topic, as the opening government brought up the nature of democracy, we're going to extend this in terms of advocating for a form of political pluralism within Egypt. We believe that political pluralism is an ideal that is necessary for advancing this democratic principle. Moreover, in actually contextualizing the nature of the situation within Egypt right now, we have to look at a few points. The first point that I'd like to look at is how the Black Bloc's movement right now is an extension of the initial revolution that took place against Mubarak. And then the second point is how this is also a justification for attacks on the Muslim Brotherhood specifically, because the opening opposition tried to say that they've attacked the Muslim Brotherhood and not the government. I'll show you how attacking the Muslim Brotherhood is a key feature in winning this war. So, when looking at these points, the first reason that we have to look to is that the revolution within Egypt itself was not only just student-led. That was an assumption that was oftentimes made in the news, that it was primarily student-led. It was definitely a huge factor, but you had socioeconomic conditions within Egypt that led to this revolution as well. There were huge levels of unemployment. There were huge repressions of any form of political discourse that in any way challenged the views of the Mubarak regime. At the point where those were the means, or the reasons why the revolution was actually advocated for, and why it became so popular, the form of government that advanced after this revolution has to be more representative of that. At the point where the current Muslim Brotherhood or Ikhwan Muslimin are not actually representing that within the Egyptian government, they're not fully understanding the reasons for why this revolution was so important. Before I move on to my second point.
There's a lack of understanding of the situation in Egypt. The Black Bloc movement is aggressively opposed to any Islamic society which represents the majority of Egypt. They're advocating an explicitly non-representative group.
That goes perfectly into my next point, which has to do with the reason why it's important to attack the Muslim Brotherhood itself. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, historically, as advocated by Tariq Ramadan, who is the grandson of the original founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, essentially was an organization that tried to reject the forms of Salafist monarchies that were occurring across the rest of the Middle East, while simultaneously also rejecting the repression within Egypt itself. And it was also in response to British oppression. That extended through the Mubarak regime when eventually Mubarak took control of Egypt because of this lack of political representation. The problem with this is that now you have that the Muslim Brotherhood has evolved into a new organization. It's taken the money of these OPEC monarch regimes throughout the rest of the Middle East, has started to accept these Salafist ideas that are radical, that are refusing the rights to vote for women, that are repressing women, that are repressing minorities, that are repressing all forms of political discourse that are not 100% in line with that Salafist organization. At the point where they're doing this, they're rejecting the very foundation in which they began. Once you accept this fact, and once you understand the reality of the Muslim Brotherhood being a key factor in Egyptian democracy currently failing, you have to look to them as the root cause that needs to be addressed. That's where the violence comes into play. That's where the radical means through which the Black Bloc are actually acting is justified. Because the Muslim Brotherhood is the face of the government. They are the government. They're the ones who are accepting the policies that are being advocated by these OPEC monarchs across the Middle East and putting them and implementing them into their society. They're no longer representing the populace within Egypt. They're not saying all Islam is bad. They're saying this Islamist ideology of exclusion is bad. That's where the Black Bloc comes into play. They're a Marxist organization, they're a radical organization, they're an anarchist organization, but they also include realms of liberalism within them. They're more inclusive in terms of their ideology. So, before I move on to direct foreign reputation, I'll go to your point.
However, you have still failed to explain how in justifying violence against the Muslim Brotherhood by any group, how that's going to perpetuate a democracy that is supposedly representative when all you're doing is still creating conflict that's not going to create a majority.
Sure. And I'll go into your point. You said that, the first speaker actually said in his point, or one of his pieces of positive matter, that preemptive actions are unjustified, which was why the Black Bloc is not justified to take their actions. The problem with that is after the Muslim Brotherhood has taken violent actions against protesters since they've gone into power. So that's that justification. There was, once the law was passed refusing the right to vote for women, the Muslim Brotherhood immediately cracked down on protests in a violent manner of those who were standing up and saying, we want the right to vote, we want this inclusion. At the point where the Muslim Brotherhood is no longer representing the ideals of all those within Egypt, the Black Bloc is representing the far left. They're representing the far wing that's advocating for more inclusion, all 100% inclusion. Though we do not make the argument that, yes, the Black Bloc should take over the entire country. We're not saying that. We're saying that their discourse is necessary in order for the development of democracy to continue within Egypt. So, what have we looked to in this round? There are a few key points that have been addressed on all sides of the aisle, but we believe that ultimately we're looking for this political pluralism. We're looking for an inclusion of ideologies within Egypt. In order to lead to that inclusion, in order to actually understand this nature of democracy within Egypt, it's important to understand the political context that this takes place in. We have a repressive society, one which is currently being led by an organization that is now owned and manipulated by the OPEC monarchs throughout the Middle East. And moreover, they are repressing in the very same manner that Mubarak did, in the very same manner that imperialist British forces did when they originally occupied Egypt, the minorities within Egypt. So in order to fully understand how this action is justified, you have to recognize the Muslim Brotherhood as the root cause. After doing so, we've established that their actions are not preemptive, which is the unjustified form of action. They're actually responding to political oppression that's already taking place. That's why violence is necessary in this case, because they're representing the complete opposite view, that we have to move away from the repression of the government, and the only means to do that is with the complete pause.
Thank you very much. Member on.
My partner and I believe that when you give a repressive government the easy ability to label you something that you're not, you should not take that action. We think you give the government, you make it easy for the Egyptian government in this case to label all of the opposition as an extreme terrorist group, and that means that none of the moderate views that are actually existing in the streets of Tahrir Square right now will be heard. So as good as the philosophical debate has been up to this point, what we think we need to talk about in the bottom half of today's debate is what the practical situation is in Egypt, and I'll talk to you about that in 2 points of extension. First, it matters very greatly what the government's perception of the Black Bloc is, because we assume that if the Black Bloc exists and uses violence, that their voice will be heard and there will be no repressive action against them. That's false. And 2, the impact on the average protester and why we think they get left out of the discussion in this case. Okay, so Ali gets up and he tells you that the Muslim Brotherhood needs to be attacked with violence because they are corrupt, they are oppressive, and they are violent. Okay, well we think the best example of how to deal with a group in Egypt that is oppressive, corrupt, and violent was how the Egyptians dealt with it 2 years ago when they overthrew Mubarak. It wasn't by having the Black Bloc be a part of that group. It wasn't by using anarchists to co-opt the revolution. It was by using mostly non-violent means. They didn't need a violent revolution to do that. So then he tells you that because there's a far-right group in the Muslim Brotherhood, there needs to be a far-left group. Okay, you may get political discourse with a far-right group and a far-left group, You don't get political discourse when the far left group is attacking the far right group and blowing up their buildings and their homes, and the far right group responds in the same fashion. We don't think we get discussion out of this. We think we get a much more violent Egypt, as First Op already told you. And then Ollie also tells you at the very end of his speech, we don't believe on the government side that the Black Bloc should take over the country. But the problem is, if Morsi is not overthrown, they will still want to overthrow Morsi. If Morsi is overthrown, where will they go? Do they stop caring about what happens in Egypt? Do they drop all their ideology and walk away from it? What is going to happen? We think they stay. We think they have a significant impact on the Egypt to come, and we think that's very dangerous when we're talking about the current situation in Egypt, and the Egypt that we want to see. No, thank you. So a couple more points of general refutation. First, we haven't really talked a lot about what the Black Bloc believes, and that might be because the government doesn't want to admit that the Black Bloc isn't sure itself what it believes. It is a fragmented anarchist group, which, you know, it seems kind of ironic, I guess. But you look at some of the basic beliefs that different leaders and members of the Black Bloc will talk about. Some of them support Trotskyist Marxism, while others say we support capitalism. Those two things generally don't go together very well. So when we think that we're getting this group to come in and be a leader of discourse, a leader of discussion, they ought to know what their own views are, and they ought not to just be a group that we accept because they're violent and they can make change happen quickly, but they need to have something to bring to the table, right? They can't just be the army of the protesters, and they certainly won't just want to be that. Okay. So, 2 points of positive matter. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hey, thanks a lot. So, voters hate hypocrisy. It's not about getting the vote, it's about getting the re-vote. It's a process, and these individuals will never get re-voted in if they do the same thing Morsi did.
Why can't we have change like we had 2 years ago? Why has Egypt changed so significantly that a more non-violent protest-type revolution can't happen? I don't think they've explained why the situation in Egypt is so significantly different than it was 2 years ago. We don't think that it necessarily is. What we think happens is that protesters are concerned that their first attempt at revolution didn't work, and the next recourse of action is the easier one, right? It's the one that promises faster change, it's the one that promises an easier revolution, and has guaranteed success, at least in the short term, of getting the leaders that they don't like out of power. We don't think you should follow that train of thought because it means you don't have anyone, you get a power vacuum in Egypt. Okay, so first point of positive matter. I brought this up in a POI long ago, but I talked about the government's perception of the Black Bloc and why that matters. So we can't just assume that the Black Bloc uses violence and then somehow either moderate protesters or the Black Bloc themselves are welcomed into the discourse that's going on in Egypt. This is why. Because first of all, the Black Bloc has the very stated goal of at least overthrowing Morsi, if not all of the Muslim Brotherhood in the government. These are the people, especially Morsi, who controls the army in Egypt. We think this is a problem, or at least the security forces. Because Morsi has already shown himself to be someone who responds in extreme action when he is afraid. When there was a terrorist attack in Sinai, he took that as grounds to purge all of his top generals. He fired them all because he took extreme action because he was worried, he was concerned that the army wasn't prepared enough, that they didn't do enough. We think it's problematic when we have a very scared leader in power in Egypt, and we're promising something that makes him fear for his life and fear for his power at the very least. But we think that perception matters when you cope, because the government, it makes it very easy, as I said in my introduction, makes it very easy for the government to label the entire opposition movement, as they're starting to do, as a violent extremist group because of the influence of the Black Bloc in the protest movement. You look at some examples that have already happened, like the examples of Israel and Palestinians. Israel uses the rhetoric when they see actions from Hamas as this is the actions of all of the Palestinians, this is why we won't come to the table with the moderate Palestinians, because one group within the Palestinians is using violence to make their point, right? That's what the Black Bloc is. They're using violence, they're a part of the protest, but the government can say this is all it is, this is all the opposition is, we don't have a reason to listen to you, we don't have a reason to do discourse with you, because we're a violent extremist group, and the government can turn lots of people against them because of that. We also see the example of like Occupy Wall Street. when there was not a lot of political change because it became a radical group expression where people had differing views, they didn't know what they were advocating for, and the politicians in DC could say, they don't even know what they believe, they're a crazy group of just young 20-somethings, and we don't care what they say, right? Because it wasn't the moderate voices that rose to the top, it was the extreme voices, it was the more radical voices. We think that's the problem. But what's the effect on the average protester? We think there are two. We think first, you lose out on the ability to contribute your voice to the discussion. Because not only does the government see the Black Bloc as taking over the protest, but the Black Bloc themselves is going to co-opt the protest movement. They're going to get the moderate voices out of the way because they have nothing to serve the Black Bloc's purposes. We also think that the protesters start to live in a state of fear because the Black Bloc is using violence. We don't know when they're going to turn against us. The government is responding in turn. We don't know who we can go to, who's going to support us. And so you get to a more violent, a more fearful Egypt. We don't think that gets anywhere towards a better path towards democracy we're proud to oppose.
Can I just remind you where the judges are? Thank you. So near the end of his speech, Calvin, who I consider a good friend, made a statement about Occupy Wall Street. And I think that points to a central problem that's occurred on the government bench. And it's a confusion with, the opposition bench. It's a confusion about where this debate is about, right? This is a debate about Egypt. Occupy Wall Street happened in the context of the United States, which is very, very different. It's a country with a functioning democracy, without a history of oppression in the last, couple of years, right? That's a very different context, and that matters. But so today I think that given that context, there's three questions that we need to consider when we decide whether or not we should support the Black Bloc movement. The first is this question of when political violence is justified. We got a lot about that on the top half and then some stuff from the bottom half as well. Second, how can we promote political pluralism in Egypt? And this is really a lot of what Ollie brought to you. And then the third question is, what are the effects of the Black Bloc movement? And this has been sort of underlying much of the debate, and I think ultimately falls on the government bench's side. But before that, some refutation. So we get this idea that the Arab Spring is the best model for how Egypt should move forward out of Calvin. I would like to point out that shortly after the Arab Spring, now, we're having a discussion about the problem of autocracy in Egypt, right? Maybe the Arab Spring wasn't the best model. We would like that to be the model, but it doesn't seem to be the case given all of the evidence that the government bench has given. Second, he talks about this inconsistent ideology and then the long-term impacts of that. We think the inconsistent ideology of the Black Bloc movement is a feature, not a bug, right? We think that in the long term, this inconsistent ideology, like what happened with Occupy Wall Street, although in a different context, means that as some of the objectives of the movement are accomplished, that it will start to break apart, right? So as it becomes less necessary, it will become less existent. And that's good. That works out pretty well for us. Finally, we get this idea of that we should really be concerned about the perception of the government. I have two responses to this. The first is that one of the things that the Black Bloc movement has the potential to do is tell Morsi that if you don't pay some attention to secular moderates, then you've got to deal with us, right? So there's that. But second, I kind of reject the whole idea, because it's essentially saying that because Morsi, out of fear, refuses to let discussion about whether or not he should stay in office take place, that we can't have this discussion, right? The preference of Morsi is for the discussion not to happen at all, and this is why the things that Percival brought to you matter, and why the Black Bloc is okay. Yes?
Again, there's a fundamental question here that they've ignored. What is the end game? What is the end game of a society where you fluctuate between different violent power groups?
Sure. The end game of this is hopefully, not guaranteed, but hopefully more political pluralism. We think we've given you a lot of evidence to suggest that that will be the end game, and that, as I just mentioned in my refutation, the Black Bloc movement becomes less important as that is accomplished. But so moving on to my questions. The first is, when is political violence justified? And we think that First Gov did a great job of explaining this. It's when the alternatives to seeking representation are blocked, right? That sometimes it is justified. In a POI I asked, the first op says that that's true, that sometimes political violence is okay, although they don't tell you when, which seems to be implied never, right? And we think it is sometimes justified, and it's when those alternatives are blocked. And we think that that's the case in Egypt, right? Because of the blocking of discussion that's occurred under Morsi in terms of the religious oppression that was talked about and the constitutional issues that we've discussed, that justifies some measure of political violence in order to move the process forward. Second, the question of how we can promote political pluralism in Egypt. And I think that this is a lot of what Ollie talked about, and I think it's crucial. The opposition's position seems to be to wait and see. We have a government that seems to be moving in the wrong direction, but we should just hold fast, and hopefully things work out, and they become more plural. We're not certain that's the best strategy, right? We think it's okay to recognize that the political pluralism that we desire isn't moving forward. We think that moving more towards discussion, more towards including other elements of society beyond the Islamic Brotherhood, and which is what the Black Bloc movement primarily is advocating for, is what's important. And we think that as that happens, Egypt becomes more plural and better. Finally, what are the effects of the Black Bloc movement? And this has been underlying the whole round. But before I discuss it, Calvin.
Okay, so your partner and the government bench tells us that it's okay to violently attack groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and just kill them or blow up their buildings or whatever. Where's the link from that to political pluralism in Egypt?
Because as political pluralism developed, because it is the demand for political pluralism that the Black Bloc movement promotes, that the Black Bloc movement, in response to the Black Bloc movement's violence, the government is forced to recognize more voices in order to prevent that violence. And because of the very fragmentation you discussed, as that becomes more true, the Black Bloc movement becomes weaker. And we think that these are the effects of the Black Bloc movement. We think that they stand to sort of refresh the movement of the Arab Spring. They stand to refresh the original ideas that Ollie talked to you about as far as the Muslim Brotherhood. We think they improve pluralism and that these things are good. The opposition tells you that because they're violent now, that the only outcome in embracing them is increased violence, and we don't think that's necessarily the case. Then the government bench is giving you a bunch of reasons why political violence is justified at times, why in this specific Egyptian context those things are true, and finally, that the Black Bloc movement will do those things. It's not necessarily that we embrace all of the Black Bloc movement's ideologies, or that it's even possible to do that, because they are fragmented. It's that we embrace the idea of pluralism, and that by promoting pluralism we lead to a stronger democracy. And so because of all of these things, I urge you to support the resolution.
Thank you very much. Opposition vote?
So we talked a lot about democracy, what it looks like, how is it supposed to function ideally, what is it supposed to look like for Egypt. There's a couple of false assumptions I think that we've made on this side of the house, and that is that Egyptian democracy has to look like democracy in the United States, for one, because they're like, oh, we want pluralism to look just like the United States, which I think if the Muslim Brotherhood was elected by the people of Egypt, is that not reflective of their choice as a democratic people, right? It doesn't have to look like us, or the West, or in that context. And we think that's no. And I'm going to bring three kind of clarifying questions that are going to come up today. One is the Black Bloc an effective agent of change? Because that's kind of what they're arguing for in this, that we want to support Black Bloc, we agree with their movement in principle, and we think that they are going to inevitably make Egypt better. That's what we've heard. And then my second is that our perception of the Black Bloc, both in the West, in Egypt itself, from the Egyptian people, does that matter? Does that matter in the context of our debate today? And third, what is the end game? Those are the 3 questions that I want to ask. So we'll talk about Black Bloc as an effective agent of change. We've heard that what we've heard across this side of the House is simply this, that we support part of Black Bloc's ideology, like they're anti-Islamist, they want these different secularization within government, they think they are fighting for the voice of the people, but at the same time we're like, yeah, we acknowledge that they use violence, but we're okay with that half the time, and we don't really agree with everything that they stand for, we don't really want them to be like involved in government after they're done, like after they've kind of accomplished their goal within the process, and we don't really think that they're going to be a valid, maybe a long-term solution. The problem with that idea is, and why they're ineffective agents of change, is that you don't get to pick and choose what you like about a movement or what you don't like about a movement. You're stuck with what that movement represents in its entirety. And what we see with the Black Bloc is they are fractured, they are incorporating violence into their ideology, and that ultimately that violence just perpetuates the currency of violence, which we're beginning to see within that context. And we just don't think that that's the way to go. Of course, Josue, you love them.
Okay, so here's the thing. Real governments fight so they can get re-elected through actually representing aggregate interest. You only do this when you have long-term goals. These people enforce Morsi to recognize that I actually have to be a government. Okay, so here's the problem. Here's the problem. So the Black Bloc, you're arguing, is kind of the big fighter for the people of Egypt. However, here's the real issue, is that their violent acts usurp and co-opt actual secularist movements within the government that are legitimate, that aren't acting out in violence, but who do you find out, who do you hear about, who's making news, who's getting a reaction around the world? It's Black Bloc and their violent acts. So it's not so much their ideology that we're hearing, it is in fact just the violence that's associated with the movement. And we don't think that is the long-term currency of political change that Egypt needs to have. We think that you're arguing for it, but the reality behind it is that you're perpetuating a currency of violence and a culture of violence within the culture, and that only true political change can occur through violence. And that's what you're arguing for from this side of the House. We disagree with it. We don't think that's what Black Bloc is, an effective agent of change. We just don't buy it. One, because they're co-opting the actual legitimate, secular, political voice within Egyptian within the politics of today. We need to have more secular voices within Egypt, not just a select few that are advocating violence and terror. I don't think it's going to be an effective model. But do perceptions matter? And this is really vitally important. Calvin brought this out to us. We think that the perception of the Black Bloc, both externally and particularly within the current government as it stands right now, is absolutely vital and absolutely important. And the reason why is because what the Black Bloc does, what the violence that ensues across the board, we've seen it throughout history. When you have a violent minority group that raises up, says, we're fighting for the people, we're doing this for the people, it only gives the government more ammunition, more rhetoric in which to clamp down, to label them as terrorists, to then tighten their restrictions across the board. We've even seen it within our own government times. It was brought up on the side of the House where, you know, September 11th, we talked about documents of change, like in democracy. We give up our personal freedoms through, we had an act of violence on September 11th, we're like, okay, we're okay with the Patriot Act because it's fun now, it's okay. No, because our perceptions change. We don't believe, and as Calvin brought out in just great analysis, the perception of the government, of the Black Bloc, is absolutely vitally important. We don't think that that makes them an effective agent of change at any level. But one of the biggest issues that's been dropped by government is that third point of the end game. The end game, we talked about it, it's been brought up on our side, hasn't really been it. If the end game is some pseudo-anarchy movement, right? And you're like, yeah, we agree with the Black Bloc. They should represent the face of Egyptian secularism. How do you get from anarchy movement to a stable government? They haven't made that link at all within the process. It's like, okay, they can be violent, they can argue for change, but they never really link the process of change. We think that that's where they're ineffective agents of change, and that the perception of that change absolutely does matter. As Calvin brought up, he gave us good points about
being linked to other organizations that have. The reason why they are not an effective agent of change is because the fact they don't have the political discourse or even the will for political discourse, if they're true anarchists in that sense, to produce change. Here's an example: the IRA within England, right? They took on violence, right? They're blowing crap up all the time. But at the end game, at the end of the game, what did they end up becoming? A political movement and a political body that then had representation within Ireland itself. Is it perfect? No, but they had an end game within that construct. That's the only way. Calvin brought up the idea of Israel and Palestine. It's a perfect example. I think it can be applied here. Here we see a government, i.e. Israel, using violent actions by Hamas with the same type of rhetoric that comes out of Black Bloc. Hey, we're fighting for the people. We're fighting for Gaza Strip, right? But again, it's an excuse that's been used by those in power to suppress, because the perception is that Hamas is all a bunch of terrorists. That's the perception, because it's the rhetoric that's given by the government in Israel's case. We're going to see that same line, and all that leads to, all that then becomes, is just an entrenchment of these two ideologies and not actual discourse. The discourse becomes the currency of violence and not the currency of change, which is discussion and the ideas that are necessary for democracy to take root. We think that's the biggest idea. For those reasons, we're happy to oppose.